Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 3rd of July of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to start with Crimea. Today the the civilians in this area mentioned a very big traffic jam. The line of cars is around 11 kilometers, so the Russians increased the level of control on this territory, trying to prevent any actions, any terrorist attacks on the Crimea bridge before the beginning of the Ukrainian greatest counteroffensive operation. And now we are moving to Kherson area. Today we got a lot of updates from this bridgehead. The Ukrainians published the video how they destroyed the control position. As you can see, this is some kind of a very big construction that the Russians were using to control the Ukrainian movements and the Ukrainian positions on the opposite bank of the river. And probably the Ukrainians managed to discover these Russian positions during the Battle of Antonov Bridge, and the Ukrainians took a decision to destroy it. The Russians also published a lot of information from this bridgehead. For example, this video is geolocated. The Russians published the video how they were attacking and destroying the Ukrainians' positions, probably ammo depots and accumulation of Ukrainian forces in this small settlement by the name of Kazatsky. Furthermore, the Russians reported that as a result of artillery strikes, they destroyed the ammo depot 126 Brigade, Territory Defense, this brigade, and this is their main positions. And also the Russians destroyed shut down the Ukrainian Su-27. According to the Ministry of Defense report, they still haven't provided us any piece of information, any updates about any video or photo confirmation, but I believe that maybe we are going to see this update very soon. Also, the Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings on the Kherson front line, the Ukrainians lost 30 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems. Now we are moving to Energodar, and today the Russians published just another video how they attacked the Ukrainians' checkpoint on their bank of the Dnipro River. As you can see, during using the FVP drone, the Russians attacked and destroyed some positions of the Ukrainians on this bank of the river. This video is geolocated, but the thing that I wanted to note and to point your attention is the situation of the water reservoir. As you can see, there are almost no water, just a few areas that are filled with the water, so the situation is critical. And but for now, the situation is not enough for the Ukrainians to start a crossing operation of this territory and to attack Energodar using just an infantry. Now we are moving to Zaporizhzhia area. The Russians report that they destroyed the ammo depot of 128th Brigade in the small settlement Malokatirinovka. As you can know, this 128th Brigade is the main forces that were involved in the attempts to attack the Russians in Zherebyanki and Petykhatki. Today, by the way, the Ukrainians made another attempt to attack Zherebyanki from Petykhatki. That attack was repelled by the Russians, and the Ukrainians, having heavy losses, were forced to step back to Stepova. The Russians controlled Zherebyanki for 100%, and they redeployed some reserves in this area. And the sources are saying that maybe the Russians will make counteroffensive within the next few days to return the lost positions in the forest between Lapkovo, Petykhatki, and Zherebyanki. Now we are moving further to Orehov. We got a lot of updates from this bridgehead. The Russians report they destroyed ammo depot 65th Brigade in the vicinity of Orehov. Furthermore, the Russians published the video how they shut down the Ukrainian Su-25 that were flying very close to the combat line, and using the manpods in this area. He was flying very close. The Russians managed to discover, shut down, and destroy the Ukrainian Su-25. Furthermore, we got more and more. We are receiving more and more updates of the Ukrainians' attempt to attack the north of Robotyne using the infantry armored vehicles. We got another video dated on the 30th of June. As you can see, this is the Bradley Square, and this is destroyed Western weapon along the forest lines. A lot of destroyed armored vehicles, a lot of destroyed and ruined trenches. Probably, maybe this is the ex-Russian positions or the ex-Ukrainian positions. Anyway, everything is reduced to ruins, including armored vehicles and fortifications in this area. Furthermore, the Russians and we discussed, if you remember yesterday, about the fierce fightings for this trenches line that Ukrainians were trying to develop and so on. And today the Russians published some kind of storming episode from this bridgehead. The Ukrainians were moving along the forest lines, along the trenches, somewhere in the vicinity of the north of Robotyne. The Russians discovered, start artillery fire, artillery shelling, and it was a very difficult operation, storming operation from the Ukrainian side, and the Russians are saying that as they're saying, the storming attempt has ended. The Ukrainians was completely defeated. The Russians launched counter-offensive operation, and as a result of fierce fightings, artillery attacks using all types of artillery, including the flamethrower systems, the Ukrainians were completely defeated, destroyed, and the Russians reported that 3 officers were captured during the counter-offensive operation. Also, they're saying that all of the Ukrainian soldiers were killed. Just 12 Ukrainian soldiers were wounded, but the Russians for some reason reported that there were no chances to evacuate those 12 soldiers. So basically, everybody who was involved in that storming operation from the Ukrainian side was killed or was destroyed on the north of Robotyne. And currently the Russians managed to return control over these trenches, and now the Ukrainians need to start everything from the beginning. Now we are moving further to the east. The Russians reported that they discovered and destroyed another commando's platoon of Ukrainians in the vicinity of Marfapol, and that the Russians destroyed the ammo depot of 23rd Mechanized Brigade in the vicinity of Uspienovka. 23rd Brigade is the main forces that took place and currently take place in attempts to establish control over Priyutina, and all attempts of that brigade to attack was repelled during the previous days. The Russians gave us another portion of videos of attacks of Ka-52 helicopter on the Vremevka tactical bridgehead. Another armored vehicles were destroyed, and the Russians, for example, the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, Sergei Shoigu, today made his own presentation about the situation on the front line. He does this presentation every single month on the beginning of the month for the previous months, and for example today he reported that since the beginning of the Ukrainian counter-offensive operation on the 4th of June, it's already months have passed since that date, and Ukrainians lost 2,500 vehicles of different types, including tanks, armored vehicles, trucks, light vehicles, pickups, and so on. 2,500. Imagine yourself this number. Believe me, if you have such a number of armored vehicles, you can create fully blooded, I believe, 5 or 6 brigades. So we can say that the Ukrainians lost armored vehicles for a round of 5-6 brigades. Furthermore, some unofficial sources from Robotyne, from the south of Orekhov Bridge, had reported that since the beginning of Ukrainian counter-offensive operation, they have already lost around 20,000 soldiers. Of course, this might be a possible complete speculation from the Russian side, trying to reduce the Ukrainian spirit, but these are numbers that we start receiving. If you know, I'm doing my own calculation of the Ukrainian losses based on the Minister of Defense report, and according to my calculation, by of today, the Ukrainians have already lost around 180 to 200,000 soldiers. Imagine yourself the numbers, and the level of losses is rising almost every single day. Also today, another military expert of Russian Federation published some analytics of the situation, of the progress of the special military operation, and it's in Russian. Maybe it's very difficult for you to read. I will explain to you. On the left, the first column, we can see the months starting from May 2022, and the second column, this one is the middle, is the square meters that the Russians control for during this or that months, and the last column is the difference between with the previous one. And based on this, the most important is the last numbers, of course. And for example, during the February, the Russians increased the territory under their control for 110 square kilometers, in March for 71, in April for 33 square kilometers, and basically all those advances was connected with the Battle of Bakhmut, when the Russians were trying to encircle, when the Russians entered the Living Road. And as you can see, starting from May, the Russians started losing the territory. For example, in May, the Russians lost 78 kilometers, and this was connected with the Russian retreat process from the flanks of Artemivsk. The Russians were forced to step back. If you remember, from the flanks, they were forced to step back from Living Road, and the Russians were forced to step back from some positions on the flanks, on the southern flank, on the Ukrainian side of the channel. And these events, this negative progress is connected when the Wagner's was replaced by the Ministry of Defense Forces, and during the June the Russians lost 92 square kilometers. So not much, but anyway, if we compare, let's say, the Russian progress from December when they launched the counteroffensive operation and the Ukrainians, we see that the difference is just 100 kilometers in Russian favor. So during the last 6 months, the Russians gained for 100 kilometers more than the Ukrainians managed to regain. So as you can see, these like positional battles. Yes, the Russians captured, let's say, Artemivsk. The Ukrainians managed to cut off the Vremevka tactical bridgehead. So we can see that exchange is almost the same for both sides. But of course, when talking about the loss in manpower, the Ukrainians had significantly higher losses in comparison with the Russians. Also, the Russians reported that they repelled 2 attacks of the Ukrainians from in direction of Staromayorska and in direction of Urozhaine. Both those attacks were repelled, and without any changes on the ground as well. And now we're moving to South Donetsk area, and we start receiving significantly high number of updates from this bridgehead. For example, the Ukrainians during the previous days made a lot of attempts to attack the Russian positions in direction of Nikolsk, in direction of, let's say, residential area between Nikolsk and Pavlovka. All those attacks were repelled, and the Russians published a fresh video of bombing and shelling Vuhledar using missiles. As you can see, it's very heavy damage the Russian dealt to this settlement and to the Ukrainian forces. A few days ago, we discussed and published a lot of videos of FVP drones attacks in this area. So something very interesting is going to happen maybe in this area, or the Russians just trying to pin down the Ukrainians and to change their focus from Novomikhailivka. We haven't received any updates from Novomikhailivka. I must say that today there were a few videos published by the Russian sources of fightings in trenches, and the videos was like marked as the fighting somewhere in Vuhledar. I haven't added those videos to this map because I'm trying to add just geolocated videos and trying to show the first of all, to confirm the combat line, to confirm the positions, and to see exact area of heavy fightings. There were a few videos from Vuhledar, but maybe those clashes were somewhere near Mikhailivka, somewhere along the trenches and forest lines in this area. But we'll see these. I believe that in a day or two, those videos will be geolocated, and we will discuss them in more details. The Russians reported that they managed to repel a lot of attacks. By the way, the Ministry of Defense reported that the total loss of the Ukrainians from Petykhatki to, let's say, Vuhledar were around 190 soldiers, a lot of losses, as you can see, 13 armored vehicles, including 2 tanks, and 6 artillery systems. As you can see, in comparison with the previous days, the level of losses among artillery systems has been increased, and the Russians, probably the Ukrainians, prepared themselves before another attack. And this is going to take place, I believe, on the end of the 5th of July. And they managed to move a lot of artillery systems to the combat line, and the Russians start attacking and bombing them. Why I suppose that Ukrainians are going to launch their attack on the 5th of July? Obviously that the 4th of July is the Independence Day in the United States of America, and as I understand, the United States authorities doesn't want to see the pictures of destroyed convoys and columns of the Western weapon, including the United States vehicles. So they just didn't want to ruin their holidays and their big holiday of the Independence Day. So I understand that this is the the final date of operational pause, and starting of the 5th of July we're going to see massive attack from Ukrainian side, where the Ukrainians are not going to count losses, manpower, anything, because they're just few days, a week before the NATO summit, and they need to show any progress and success. The Russians repelled Ukrainian attacks in the vicinity in direction of Vadiane. The Russians repelled the Ukrainian attack in direction of Pervomaiska, and also the Russians published a lot of videos from Avdiivka. The Russians are bombing and shelling Avdiivka from many sides. For example, in this video we see how the Ukrainians were trying to send some munition to the positions on the edge, and the Russians, using the night vision equipment, managed to discover those trucks, cars, and they attacked them and destroyed them. Furthermore, the Russians destroyed another another ammo depot in the south of Avdiivka. There was a very heavy explosion after that attack, and also the Russians published the results of fightings with the Ukrainians between Krasnogorovka, Veselaya, Avdiivka, when the Ukrainians made during the previous days made a lot of attempts to return control of Veselaya and the bridgehead between these settlements, and the Russians published the video how they were using man parts and how they were destroying the Ukrainians' ammo depots, armored vehicles, and many different types of weapon and facilities on this bridgehead. Now we're moving closer to Artemivsk. We got a lot of updates from this territory. If you remember, the Ukrainians during previous days made a lot of attempts to attack the trenches and Klishchiivka itself, and some Western sources reported, like Syriac map, that Ukrainians managed to capture this bridgehead, but that was something like a small speculation probably, because the Russians, for example, reported they managed to repel every single attack from the Ukrainian side. Furthermore, the Russians today reported that that was some kind of trap. They allowed the Ukrainians to cross the channel to enter these fortifications to get as deep as possible inside of this bridgehead, and after that the Russians made massive artillery flamethrowers attack, and those who managed to survive from the Ukrainian side left this bridgehead or maybe ran away from this area. It's very difficult to understand. Also, the Russians reported they attacked and destroyed the headquarters of 28th Mechanized Brigade in Delivka, and I reminded that 28th Brigade during the previous days were pretty successful in the vicinity of Kurdyumovka. They managed to first clear the channel, then they managed to cross the channel and to capture the first defense line, and the Russians took a decision to focus a little bit on them and to pin down them at least for a few days until they will solve the issue with the command center and headquarters. Also, the Russians published the video how they destroyed M777 howitzers somewhere in the vicinity of Pritiechino. This video is geolocated. This event took place recently, maybe not today, and as you can see, the Russians using drones discovered and attacked the M77 howitzer in this area using just a regular drone Landsat. Now we're moving further, and the Russians reported that the total loss of the Ukrainians on the front line from Donetsk to Artemivsk were around 260 soldiers, 9 armored vehicles including 1 tank and 2 artillery systems. Now we're moving to Siversk bridgehead. We got also a lot of updates. The Russians published another video of destroyed ammo depot, or not ammo depot, my bad, of artillery systems in the south of Siversk that Ukrainians were using to supply and support the offensive operation from Razdolovka to Vuhledar. The Russians managed to discover, and using then a very accurate strike, they destroyed that ammo depot, they destroyed artillery systems, so they dealt significant losses for the Ukrainians' artillery facilities and systems in the vicinity of Siversk. The Ukrainians published a failed attempt of the Russians to attack their positions in Sporne, and basically this video is geolocated, and this video controls at least partial control over this field of the Russian forces. Basically, as you can see, the Russians were trying to attack the Ukrainians from the north, and the Ukrainians discovered the Russians and they destroyed a few tanks and launched artillery shelling. After that, the Ukrainians cleared the territory by dropping the bombs inside the tanks using the FVP drones. And basically what happened, the Russians were trying to attack from the north using the tank carousel, but the Ukrainians discovered those tanks and started artillery bombing and shelling of the Russian positions. Few tanks were damaged, the infantry left the tanks and started running away, and those tanks that were left on the fields after that was destroyed by the Ukrainian drones. That was the results of unsuccessful attack from the Russian side, and this attack took place recently, today, maybe yesterday, the day before yesterday. Also, the Russians reported a repelled attack of the Ukrainians in the vicinity in direction of Zolotarivka. The attack was repelled, but without any numbers or something like this. And we got lots of updates from Lyman front line. The Ukrainians continue sending more and more commandos and scouts platoons in direction of Dibrova and direction of Kuzmina. And those platoons, at least today, the Russians report they managed to discover 2 platoons, and the Russians published the video of another portion of captured forces of 95th Storm Assault Brigade. This is the forces of 95th Air Assault Brigade, and this brigade, most of the force of that brigade was trained in the Western countries. And in the Western countries, there was 5 soldiers. The rest of the squad was destroyed. Also, the Russians published the video of bombing and shelling of Ukrainian positions in the vicinity of Tarskoye. This video is geolocated, and this video confirms the controls of the Ukrainian control over this forest, over this part of the forest. The Russians, using the drones, discovered Ukrainian positions and bombed them using all types of weapons they have. Also, the Russians reported they repelled attack of the Ukrainians in the vicinity of the Tarskoye salient. All those attacks were repelled, and the Russians are saying that currently the Russians took a decision to just to defend themselves. There were no offensive operation from the Ukrainians, from the Russian side. The previous week there was a few attacks, but the main purpose of those attacks was to develop the Russian bridgehead before greatest upcoming Ukrainian attack. And today there was some unconfirmed piece of information that the Ukrainians have redeployed 44th Mechanized Brigade in direction of Lyman in this area, and basically currently, and also the Ukrainians reported that the Russians, for example, accumulated around 180,000 soldiers on the line between Kupiansk and Artemivsk. So starting from Artemivsk to the north, there are around 180,000 soldiers and around 50,000 soldiers just in the vicinity of Artemivsk, and the rest is on the Kupiansk and Lyman front line. So if the Russians have accumulated such a big army, I wonder what is the number of Ukrainian forces, because the Russians are saying that, for example, Ukrainians attacks Lyman front line with the bigger army than the Russians have. So I wonder what is the level and number of Ukrainians in this area. But based on the information we have, piece of information we have about the number of brigades that were deployed, I believe that there are a very big army of Ukrainians on this territory, and they do have plans to attack and to penetrate the Russians' defense orders and to get inside of Crimea. So we'll see whether they're able to do this or not. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings on this territory, the Ukrainians lost 90 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, and 2 artillery systems. Now we are moving further to Kupiansk. The Russians published the video, and the Russians reported they destroyed the ammo depot of 103rd Territory Defense Brigade. This is the brigade, and they destroyed the brigade positions, ammo depot in Pischane. And also the Russians published a series of videos of attacks using all types of artillery system they have in the small settlement by the name of Petropavlovka that located on the south of Sinkovka. And this very important video, there is nothing special on this video. The Russians published another geolocated video of destroyed trucks, armored vehicles, artillery systems. I would like to pay your attention to another important aspect. I want you to understand this very, very clear. On this, let's discuss this picture. This is small settlement and the Kupiansk front line. The things that you can see as the road, some kind of buildings, and a very nicely developed network of trenches. So basically, as I understand, we don't have these satellite video or pictures and so on. We just have some small screens, some small frames from videos we can find in the open source. But basically, as I understand, the Ukrainians maybe have possibilities to start their journey from Kharkiv in one side of trenches and to get from in Kupiansk from another. So basically, this is not even like a territory. This is like a complete network of trenches. And basically, this is the main reason why the Russians are so slowly in Kupiansk and why they're not attacking this territory, because of very rich developed network of trenches from the Ukrainian side and fortifications. The Russians had a very nice experience, not their own. They watched the Ukrainians attempt to attack in direction of Robotyne on Bradley Square. As we discussed, the Minister of Defense Shoigu reported that Ukrainians lost around 2,500 armored vehicles just for 1 month among those trenches, the Russian trenches. So basically, the Russians understand the chances of their army to storm Kupiansk and all these settlements. As you can see, very rich developed network of trenches. It's I don't think that it's even possible to during the modern warfare to capture these trenches without using, let's say, nuclear weapon or something like this, or you're gonna have significant level of losses. So that's why the Russians are not attacking, they're not developing their offensive operation, and they're very slowly and trying to reduce the Ukrainian army somewhere in the forest, somewhere among the fields and so on, but not inside of the settlements. It's impossible, even I would say, to capture. The only thing they can do is to encircle. And now we are moving to the most interesting part of this video. The Ministry of Defense reported about the loss of Ukrainians, around 20 soldiers, and now we are going to Sumi area. These days, we start receiving more and more updates from this bridgehead. For example, today, the Ukrainians published at least 2 videos from the central of Kupiansk, and the first one we see like a smoke, and after that heavy explosion. And on this video we see the Russian Granny was flying right to the target. It goes down, then there was a very heavy explosion, and after that we're going to see a black smoke that raises inside the town. So basically the Ukrainians don't have at all air defense systems, at least in Sumi area. And for example, a few days ago we got update that Ukrainians reported and announced about evacuation from Sumi area. It was a few days ago, maybe a week or two. Then we got update that Ukrainian authorities started evacuation of industrial plants, factories from this area to the western part of Ukraine. And for example, from the Ukrainian side today we got 2 videos how the Ukrainians using drones destroyed 2 camera positions of the Russians along the border that the Russians were using to control the situation along the border. And this one took place in Stara Sele and another one in Dronovka. This is another video how the Ukrainians destroyed the camera, and this same video we saw in Kherson area. So I must say that something is going to take place, to happen in Sumi region. And the reason why something is going to happen in Sumi region we just discussed during the video of Kupiansk. So basically this is the reason of that something is going to happen in Sumi, because the old front line, the old combat line from Kupiansk to, let's say, Kherson is just one big network of trenches from both sides. And it's not just along the combat line. Nobody knows the real depth of these trenches deep inside both territories. No, we know about the Russians. For example, we can calculate even the depth of the Russian trenches. Let's say on this example, let's calculate, for example, the length of the Russians' defense trenches on this bridgehead is around 63 kilometers. Imagine yourself, 63 kilometers is just the full of trenches network and something like this. So believe me, the Ukrainians have the same, and this video on Kupiansk confirms. And the only possible solution, if the Russians want to make some changes and to break the situation finally, is to attack the Ukraine somewhere else. And the only bridgehead that we also don't know for sure, but something tells me that Ukrainians didn't pay much attention to Chernihiv and Sumi area, because most of the forces are located in the combat line and they didn't have just resources to build the same fortifications. I believe that there are some fortifications as the Russians have, but they're not so deep, and basically this is the only area to attack. And furthermore, for these reasons, we discussed about some Wagner redeployment in Belarus, and today we got the first photos of Wagner camp from this territory. So this is Wagner camp, at least the photo of one of those camps. And we discussed that probably the Poland will move their brigades to the western part of Ukraine, and this is the reason, a nice chance for Wagners to attack, let's say, like Polish forces in the same area. But there is another option for Wagners, and basically they're located in Belarus with one purpose. At some necessary time, these forces will be redeployed, let's say, to Bryansk area, and Wagners will start offensive operation in Sumi and Chernihiv as well. So a lot of things. And for example, the military expert Russian Rybar also reported that currently we see significant level of accumulation of Russian forces along the border, and maybe he was talking about accumulation of the force somewhere here. For now, there are no real photo, video confirmations, but the Russians are trying to prepare something, and maybe they're going to create this buffer zone to reduce the level of artillery shelling of Russian territory, of Bryansk area, of Kursk region, of Belgorod region. But the question is not about the Russians are going or not to create this buffer zone. The question is how deep the Russians are going to create this buffer zone, and we will be able to understand this just during the next months of fightings on this territory. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.